and welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have with us Mr. Tim Schultz, President of the First Amendment Partnership. We have Mr. Andre Wong, General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, there's this question regarding whether or not religious freedom abroad has any impact on national interests in the United States. You know, religious freedom is the heartbeat of America's 249-year history. It's a principle that's founded in the First Amendment, and it's vital to our identity. Under the current Trump administration, we're starting to see that there's a lot of pushing as it relates to countering religious persecution abroad. But the cornerstone of U.S. policy seems to be America first. But there's a recent nomination of a former Representative, Mark Walker, who's the new ambassador for international religious freedom, and that seems to signal a bold commitment to this cause of Christianity and erasing any worldwide issues as it relates to religious freedom. You know, some people think religious freedom is just a buzzword for conservative advocacy. But Tim Schultz, when I take a look at what's going on, and you think about the idea that we are trying to focus on not polarizing issues from a religious standpoint in this country, why does it make any difference at all if there's any focus on what's going on in religious freedom abroad? Some say it connects with American interests. Others think it has nothing to do except playing politics. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Orland, the good news is that as far as the Congress goes, international religious freedom and support for it is quite bipartisan. And I think the reason is because Republicans believe maybe in religious freedom very broadly. That's kind of a Republican thing these days. But I think Democrats tend to view it as part of the cluster of larger human rights that are universal. And so sort of international human rights interests mean you can't persecute people because of something so fundamental to them. And then I think as far as whether it's in America's national interest, look, when religious minorities, whether they be Muslim or Christian or anything, are persecuted for their faith, and usually in other countries, that doesn't just mean that they're regulated. It means that they're subject to violence and death for their faith, right? When that happens, it creates people like fleeing their countries. It creates refugee flows. It creates instability. It just does lots of things to the international global order that neither Republicans nor Democrats want to happen. So actually, that is a bit of good news, is that I think there still is a bipartisan commitment to international religious freedom. And I think that's good.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on Tim's point there, Orland, I think it's important to recognize that the way you frame the question is international religious freedom and American interests abroad. There's a twist here that I think is compelling, which is that most religions in the world, Eastern and Western, have moral imperatives that exceed the expediencies of political calculations, right? So, for instance, as a Christian, one might have a commitment to something being right, irrespective of whether or not it's in America's best interest. The moral imperatives of so many world religions so far exceed political calculation that I think religious freedom internationally is something that we ought to stand up for, regardless of whether or not it's in America's interest, right? And that's the real challenge, to advocate for religious freedom with integrity, if we're going to really take that seriously.
You know, Todd, when I look at the selection of Representative Walker for this position, some would say that that is a statement in and of itself. He's not considered to be a hard right-winger in any way. He's considered to be, someone that's more middle of the road. Kind of a surprising choice, but maybe that speaks to the bipartisan aspect of this that Tim Schultz was just mentioning.
Yeah, Orlin, and other choices that prior administrations have made, including Democrats and Republicans, I think have also shown a level of bipartisanship. During the first Trump administration, former governor of Kansas was nominated. That got some pushback, but by all accounts did a good job, and in that particular setting did it in a bipartisan way. So I do agree that this is an area that there can be bipartisan agreement on. When you're talking about religious freedom overseas, it is such a problematic area that it's hard to understand that there's not a problem, and I think that can bring both parties in the U.S. Together on that very narrow issue.
But Andre, what's interesting is when you think about religious freedom, we seem to have a world that's getting a lot more secular. We were looking at some numbers just recently in Canada where only 16% of the population even wants to go to church anymore. So when we start thinking about religious freedom, how do we juxtapose those thoughts when it looks like we've got a much more secular world outside of the United States, but yet we want to judge it, it sounds like, from U.S. guidelines?
Yeah, Orlin, that's legit. And when you look at it from a pragmatic point of view, the interests of the United States go beyond that. We look at authoritarian influences in other parts of the world. Many authoritarian regimes suppress religion to maintain control. And so the U.S. support of religious freedom undermines authoritarian narratives and boosts pro-democracy movements, as well as fulfilling our moral and constitutional commitments. U.S. foreign policy often reflects domestic values, including freedom of conscience and separation of church and state. So promoting religious liberty abroad does strengthen our moral authority of the United States. But then also, lastly, is it advances economic interests. If you look at countries with high levels of religious freedom, they tend to be more economically open and innovative. So yeah, I completely agree that it goes beyond just our own religious values as a country, but also there's also some practical and pragmatic factors to look at.
But Tim, is the International Religious Freedom Act, is it kind of more window dressing? Does it have any real teeth to it? It sounds like something nice to talk about on a regular basis, but at the end of the day, what do we actually do if we find out that there's problems internationally that we have issues with?
Well, look, when you think about the kinds of governments that persecute people on the basis of their faith, our ability to persuade those kinds of governments is limited, right? North Korea, it persecutes believers. We can say to North Korea, we don't like that, but does North Korea seem like the kind of place that will listen? So I think the idea is just more to get freedom-loving countries who all have a common sense of the dignity of the human person and of the illegitimacy of religious persecution to try to use moral persuasion on those boundary countries, the countries that may be persecuting or sort of tolerating persecution, but may be open to persuasion, right? Those are the countries that actually it may make a difference in. So, look, we're not doing sanctions on countries. We're certainly not going to war. Those are the things that usually the coercive international tools that we have at our disposal. These are carrots, not sticks. These are tools of persuasion to countries that are persuadable. And that's just the nature. I think, a sense of realism has to inform how much of a difference in this we can actually make.
I think what Tim Schultz just described there is something that the philosopher Immanuel Kant tried to achieve in one of his political essays called Perpetual Peace, where he hoped that we could gather a league of nations that would promote what he called the kingdom of ends. Tim Schultz talked about the dignity of the human person, and that's central to Immanuel Kant's moral and his political philosophy. So, again, as Tim said, these are carrots. These aren't really weapons. We can try to induce good behavior, but we can't force it on others. And meanwhile, we have to make sure that we are modeling that behavior ourselves. The example that we set is the thing that gets us furthest when it comes to persuading other countries to get on board and support religious freedom.
But Todd, does this start to get a little bit tricky? We talk about the separation of church and state, but politically, we see a lot of politicians saying that maybe that shouldn't exist. Maybe those specific words don't exist. And it almost seems when we talk about religious activities in the U.S., it seems to be more Christianity first and then everything else following after that. Or am I missing something here?
Well, no, I think religious freedom goes well beyond Christians, and a number of the lawsuits that have been brought in other enforcement in the U.S. We have a long history of protecting religious freedom of minority religions. And yeah, different groups like to talk about different protections. As Beckett says, one of the leading law firms, everyone, from atheists to Zoroastrianists, get protected. So it is, I think, much broader than that. And I don't think that there's any separation of church and state issues with giving people religious freedom, especially overseas.
Andre, do you agree with that point?
Yeah, and I want to touch on what Tim Schultz mentioned about our moral authority as a country, but also our influence overseas. It really does go to promoting global stability and influencing countries that are around the region. So our leadership in defending Uyghur Muslims in China places pressure on other nations to take similar moral positions, and creating those alliances and a broader coalition around human rights. So I agree that there's power in numbers. Promoting tolerance in places like Iraq, Nigeria, helps reduce extremism and sectarian violence, and then influence countries across borders and ultimately affects U.S. interests as well. So I do believe that we do have to act with that kind of moral authority when it comes to international religious freedom.
If I could jump in, Orlin, I mean, one of the other carrots we have that sometimes does dovetail with our human rights kind of promotion interests is aid, right? Mm-hmm. Give money, and in the course of our federal budget, it's not a big number, but it sounds big. If you're talking about billions, that sounds like a lot to regular people. Well, aid has gone down in this administration, and it's a legitimate political position to take, but it does take away one of the carrots that we use, right, to try to induce good behavior by some of those, as we say, iffy, but not North Korea iffy, type regimes. So it's just worth watching whether the decline in aid under this administration impacts our ability to use carrot inducements on some of those iffier countries.
Well, and it sounds like that's where we need to be as a nation. If we're going to uphold the moral authority, we've got to set the moral authority, but to ensure that we are also watching what's happening internationally, because it seems pretty clear that it impacts what we're doing here at home. We're starting to see some interesting activity happening as ICE is making its way around the country. And we see that there's the Quaker congregation that they are suing the Department of Homeland Security. A group of Quaker congregations has decided that because of the changing policy that has taken place as it relates to immigration and customs and enforcement agents that are now carrying out operations in what was so-called before sensitive locations, houses of worship, playgrounds, schools, hospitals, without approval from supervisors. The policy, which had pretty much been in place for multiple administrations, the current administration decided under the Trump administration that we'd like to rescind that activity. And as a result thereof, there's now a question that whether or not the activity of going into churches and quote unquote causing, I guess what the Quakers may call a chilling effect on individuals that decide that they want to come and worship, to be concerned about the possibility of ICE agents coming in and getting involved in pulling them out of services and potentially being deported. Todd, when you take a look at this Quaker case, they seem to be one of the first denominations that decided we want to get out into the legal atmosphere of this, and looking at this from a quote unquote religious perspective, and from the idea that this was a policy that existed, but not necessarily something that was quote unquote put into law. But when you take a look at this particular set of circumstances, Todd, what are the new issues that are going to be coming up that we may be seeing that we didn't have to fight before?
Well, Orlin, I think the first thing to keep in mind, as we shoot this, it's mid to late August of 2025. This policy change was made shortly in January of 2025. And while there was an injunction with the Quakers, we have not seen a massive change in ICE enforcement policies around churches or schools or hospitals or other areas. There's, people on Sunday or Saturday morning have not had agents coming in. There are still protections in the Fourth Amendment about where they can go. This particular lawsuit, which was granted in Maryland, sought much broader relief. It sought a nationwide injunction. It didn't get that. It got a handful of places that were related to the actual plaintiffs. The judge in this case, I think, probably understood where the Supreme Court was going to go about nationwide injunctions and narrowed his down to just the people that was in front of him. And so, I think this is one of those things that back in January and February of 25 was kind of a big issue, but the administration and the agency at the time said they didn't plan a major enforcement change. And so far, there doesn't appear to have been some. There may have been some limited circumstances, but other areas where they've done a lot of enforcement, say, in traffic stops and so forth, which there has seemed to have been a nationwide change on, or at least in certain states, we haven't seen this on the religious side.
Right, and yeah, Todd's right on that. We're not seeing raids with impunity on places of worship and schools, but yeah, I mean, what we are seeing is an increase of enforcement while agents wait on the street. The rule of thumb is if we know who's inside, we'll just sit outside. We'll sit out there and just wait for them to come out. And the constitutional issues here, you have the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and 14th Amendment. First Amendment, of course, protects free exercise of religion and the right to assemble. This immigration policy, while the government is not outright banning religious worship, the practical effect of the enforcement can be coercive or intimidating and potentially violating those free exercise rights. Arresting individuals in houses of worship could be seen as discriminatory or suppressive, even unintentionally. But then also you have the Fourth Amendment, which protects from unreasonable searches and seizures. Sensitive locations, schools, churches, hospitals, carry, I believe, and I can argue, an expectation of privacy, especially in areas like classrooms and hospital rooms. And so you have these constitutional factors in play, but then also the 14th Amendment, where you have the clause that prohibits discriminatory enforcement. And so targeting areas that are used primarily by immigrant and minority communities, such as Spanish churches, bilingual schools, may raise a disparate impact for selective enforcement.
I think the real scandal here with this policy is that Congress is left completely off the hook. Congress doesn't have to do anything because the president of the United States is governing by executive order, and he's governing based on a legal theory of a vast expansion of executive power that, frankly, we haven't seen in a long time. And I'm disappointed to see that the Supreme Court, through their shadow docket, for those who might not be familiar with that terminology, it's a docket in which the Supreme Court gives attention to, or rules rather, on cases that have not been fully briefed on the merits, but instead require some kind of preliminary ruling, like on an injunction or something of that nature.
Yeah.
And what has benefited President Trump is that the Supreme Court of the United States, through a number of rulings on the shadow docket, has almost become his private legislature, while Congress does nothing. I'm left to wonder if at the root of this policy is a desire for the president himself to maintain immigration as an issue before the people. And because he is such a television-oriented person who has used TV to garner much of his political success, you don't want Congress to do anything. You don't want bipartisan immigration legislation that would bring these raids to an end, because he wants to show America that this is a campaign promise that he's fulfilling. We're going to get them all out. And so I think beneath what's happening with the Quakers and their lawsuit against Homeland Security, I think we need to interrogate a little more intentionally exactly what is going on here. Congress has essentially abdicated its policy-making function to the president. And the president seems to be governing by executive orders that, at least in the meanwhile, the Supreme Court is allowing to be enforced. And I think that's the real scandal here.
I have a slightly different take on this, Orlin, which is maybe a little surprising. But, Congress makes laws about immigration, but the enforcement of our immigration laws, like all of our laws, is left to the executive branch. It's the enforcement agency. And the executive branch, in my opinion, the things that Trump is doing, for the most part, are things that the Biden administration had the legal authority to do as well. They didn't want to for different reasons. Certainly, I think that Dr. Golden is right. There's a kind of theatrical or made-for-TV kind of aspect to this. But I think in terms of just on this one question about how is ICE enforcing immigration laws? How exactly is it doing it? Had the Biden administration wanted to do it in precisely this way, I think they had the exact same legal authority that the Trump administration does. When Trump came into office in January, there were wide predictions that there would be raids on schools and school was in session then, that there would be raids on churches, which were in session year round. That really hasn't happened. I think there have been some isolated incidents where people have said, I don't feel comfortable going to church because I'm worried. But, look, there's a huge, also very television savvy group of folks who would love to find examples of churches being raided or love to find examples of schools being raided and kids pulled out. We don't really see that. So again, I am not commenting on the legitimacy of or prudence of Trump's use of ICE here. I'm commenting on the legality of it, and I'm commenting on, has it sort of ended up like the more progressive critics predicted back in January? I don't think it has, and I think to be intellectually honest, we have to say that.
Also, I'd like to point out, Tim Golden, makes reference to the shadow docket, a term, by the way, you won't find anywhere in the legal press or in the law. It's just simply a term made up by an advocate. The Supreme Court, to the best of my knowledge, has said nothing on any of these cases challenging churches. The case that we talked about, the Quaker case, is currently in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals on interlocutory appeal. Some of the others were denied on standing. So unless Tim has another example, I don't know the Supreme Court has done anything on this. The injunctions that have been put in place are still there. And I think part of that reason is, as Tim said, this just hasn't happened. The administration said it wasn't a priority. There were some technical reasons why getting rid of that policy needed to be, they felt it needed to be done. The other half of it, I would say as well, is there were individuals and churches who tried to turn their places into sanctuaries. So it wasn't just, on Sunday morning or Saturday morning or during services, but people would live there actively trying to keep themselves from being deported. And, I think that puts churches in a very different situation, right? It's one thing to say our religious beliefs, we should not be interrupted during our services. That's another thing to say, their Panama embassy, or an embassy in Panama, harboring a dictator, right? Is that what churches are supposed to be doing? And does the government have to just, we can't go in here? And I think, that is the other half of it that, that exists as well.
Yeah, I just like to clarify. I never made any claims that the Supreme Court made any either preliminary or substantive rulings in cases involving churches. I was making a broader point about Congress abdicating its policymaking function to a president who seems obsessed with portraying himself as someone who's fulfilling campaign promises. As for the phrase or the terminology shadow docket, okay, so it's not found in traditional legal circles and people don't talk about it in horn books and law schools. But the fact of the matter is that it's a docket in which the court is able to give the president short-term wins without cases being fully briefed and argued on the merits. So whether I use the term shadow docket or some other term, and whether or not it's recognized in traditional legal circles, as a practical matter, is really irrelevant.
Well, I just want to say, Tim went into a kind of Todd McFarlane voice there for a few seconds. I would like us to do a whole segment with him talking in that voice, please, going forward.
Andre?
I just want to just close this out by saying I agree with both Tims. Tim Schultz is absolutely correct that it's basic civics that the executive branch enforces the law, judicial branch interprets the law, legislative branch makes the law. Dr. Golden, his point is well taken that immigration policy is enshrined in Article 1, Section 8 of the Enumerated Powers Clause of Congress, that they have plenary authority over areas of naturalization and immigration. It's right there. So I can sympathize with Dr. Golden's position.
Well, I'm going to close this out by just simply saying that we'll have to wait and see what the real impact is going to be. The reality is that we're seeing more activity on the streets than we're actually seeing inside these buildings and places that are sensitive. But then maybe that was the whole purpose of it from the very beginning. So the realities are sometimes we just have to wait and to determine what the future really holds. Hey, Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Orlin, we've talked about bipartisanship, China, executive branch enforcement. All of those come together in the fact that to this day, a law passed almost unanimously by Congress, the TikTok ban, still has not been enforced by the Trump administration. I think it's actually lawless and unprecedented and very troubling.
Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
Peter Damsky, a white law student at the University of Florida School of Law, wrote a seminar for his originalism class. And in that essay, he argued essentially for return to Dred Scott. He argued that the Constitution of the United States was intended only to apply to white people and should only apply to white people. Now, I think this is problematic because we are now forced to address a question that should have been decided way back in the 19th century, around 1851, when Frederick Douglass argued that the Constitution was anti-slavery and therefore applied to everyone.
Wow.
So it's unfortunate that we have to go back to those arguments, but I think we do in this day and time.
Andre Wong, tell me something I don't know.
Prior to 2003, the Immigration and Naturalization Service was the largest law enforcement agency in the federal government. After the passage of the Patriot Act, the agency was trifurcated into the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, Customs and Border Protection, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Todd, tell me something I don't know.
One of the favorite quotes in Washington, D.C. is talking about budgets is $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. That quote has generally been attributed to Everett Dirksen, former Republican senator and minority leader. However, there is no evidence that he actually said that, and the origin of the term is very unclear.
Well, thanks a lot for that information, guys. Really loved our conversation today. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.